There's an old joke that Jews don't have heaven and hell. When we all die, we all go to the same place where Moses and Rabbi Akiba deliver lessons on the Torah endlessly. And for the righteous, this is heaven. And for the wicked, this is hell. Now, it's obviously it's a joke, but it reflects the fact that Jews are not particularly preoccupied with the afterlife. Compared to Christianity, for example, the afterlife is not a central, or it's not as central a component of the Jewish religion as is this life. Okay? Yet, even Jewish readers find it surprising that in this book about injustice in the world, nobody in the book of Job suggests that punishment and reward come in the next life. Okay. This solution to the afterlife, solution to the problem of injustice, is simply an extension of the "it's a test" solution to the problem of theodicy. There we go. So the "it's a test" solution says that yes, in the short run, it seems that good people suffer and some wicked people prosper. But in the long run, all accounts are made good, and we all get what we deserve. So the afterlife simply extends this timeline past the end of life. If you don't see justice served even in the long run in this life, in this world, that's because you're just a human and can't see what happens in the next life. Okay, so it just takes the long run from the long run of this life all the way to the hereafter. The doctrine of the afterlife holds that if there's a God, and if God is just, then there is an afterlife in which God rewards the just and punishes the unjust. Because otherwise, the injustice on earth speaks against God's justness. The afterlife is the only realm in which God can fix injustice and display his justness. Now, this understanding of life and death and of divine justice is not biblical, but post-biblical. And I'm talking about the Hebrew Bible here, not the Christian Bible, not the New Testament. There's little evidence for a spiritual afterlife in the Hebrew Bible, and none at all in the Torah. Okay. This is particularly evident in the book of Job, dedicated as it is to the problem of injustice and theodicy. Okay. In this book, neither Job, nor his friends, nor God, nor the narrator mentions an afterlife as a possible solution to the problem of theodicy. Okay. If an afterlife were a serious element in Israelite thought at the time, then the book of Job would not be so morally challenging to its intended audience. Okay. At least one of the book's characters would have been able to console Job by reminding him that God compensates good people for injustices in this world with rewards in the world to come. Okay, it would have been an obvious way to console or to explain to Job his situation, his afflictions. Okay, so this belief was simply not part of Israelite theology in the biblical era. Okay. Few biblical scholars today see in the Hebrew Bible an otherworldly heaven or an immaterial soul that continues to live when the body expires. The Bible does not oppose spirit and matter, or mind and body. Okay. Later books, from the time of the Babylonian exile and thereafter, okay, so some later books in the Bible, from the Babylonian exile era and the period of the Second Temple, and definitely non-biblical texts from later on, from the Maccabean era and the Roman era, including the New Testament, those books, those later books, exhibit more spiritual elements in Judaism. Okay, elements that are not evident in the Torah and in the earlier biblical books. Okay, but in later biblical books and in even later non-biblical books, you do see more and more of this spiritual and mystical or elements in coming into Judaism. And this explains why Christianity has a stronger conception of the afterlife than Judaism. And Christianity was born in that era, in the era of the Second Temple, or of the Second Temple, or even past it. And so it was born with a strong notion of an afterlife. And its founding text deals with the afterlife extensively. Okay, so the afterlife is commonsensical for Christians because Christianity does feature a body-soul dualism. Okay, this idea that the two are separate and even in tension or conflicting. Okay, so not all Christians go as far as claiming that the body is the prison of the soul, but virtually all Christians see the body and the soul as separate entities that are in conflict or tension with one another. Okay? Thus, the death of the body is not understood as destructive or detrimental to the soul. Okay? Biblical Judaism did not exhibit this kind of dualism. Okay? The body was seen as nourishing the soul, just like a candle nourishes a flame. Okay? When the candle expires, so does the flame. You know, the flame doesn't go anywhere. Okay? Now, when Judaism did incorporate more mystical or apocalyptical elements during the Second Temple, and increasingly in the 3 or 4 centuries after, in the late classical period, after the destruction of the temple. So when Judaism developed these, or adopted or developed these more mystical and apocalyptical elements, then the distinction between body and soul, along with an afterlife for the soul, became a more prominent feature in Judaism. And by the Middle Ages, this belief in an afterlife took firm hold in Judaism. Okay? And yet, even today, the immortality of the soul and heaven and hell and resurrection and the messianic future are not a primary concern in Judaism, whereas in Christianity, they are central preoccupations. Okay. Now, what Jews actually believe happens after death has changed over time, therefore. Okay. An afterlife in which God rewards and punishes people was foreign to biblical Israelites. Okay. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, has no clear reference to an afterlife at all. Whereas the Egyptian religion was obsessed with death and afterlife. Okay. By contrast, the Torah is focused on this world. Okay. Biblical books that follow the Torah do include a handful of passing references to the afterlife, but no real discussion of it. Okay? It is not. It's just not an important topic for the biblical author. And from these passing references in the Old Testament, it's understood. The conception we get of the Bible, of the Hebrew Bible's take on the afterlife before the Babylonian exile, before the period of the Second Temple, is that all people, Jews and Gentile alike, all people go to a netherworld called Sheol, which is a dark place deep in the earth in which shadowy spirits, ghosts, that are called Rephaim, just the word for ghost. That's where they dwell. Okay, so everyone goes to the Sheol, somewhere deep in the ground, and that's where these ghosts, these remnants of us dwell. And this fate is, by all appearances, final. Like there's no going back, no resurrection, no coming back up to this world. Therefore, in that episode when King Saul goes to the sorceress to summon the ghost of Samuel, she summons the ghost from this dark ghost world in the ground, the Sheol. Okay, and Samuel is, by all accounts, a righteous man. Okay, so and yet we find him in Sheol, in that netherworld, with the rest of the dead, good and bad. Moreover, this understanding of the afterlife is consistent with the beliefs of biblical Jews' neighbors, including the Edomites, Moabites, Canaanites, Greeks, and Babylonians, but not the Egyptians. Okay. However, during, as time moved on, and during the time of the, as we move forward into the period of the Second Temple, and this is 6th century BC to around 1 century AD, okay, into the Roman period. So after the Jews returned from the Babylonian exile, under Persian rule at that point, Judaism developed a new apocalyptic eschatology, okay, a belief in the end of days, in which the dead shall be resurrected, okay, which was not part of an earlier of the Torah, definitely, and not of the earlier, First Temple books of the Bible. And this new feature might have been, there's debate about how this element came into Judaism or developed in Judaism. Okay. One theory is that it came into Judaism during the Babylonian exile. Okay, that it was a product of Eastern influences on Jews when they were in exile back east in Iraq or Persia. But another explanation is that it might have been a completely internal development within Judaism during their epic struggles with their Greek rulers and generally with the dominant Hellenic culture of the Near East in the 3rd and 2nd century BC. Okay. And the second theory, that it's homegrown, is that it's a development within Judaism rather than an import. The second theory is tied to the heroic sacrifice of Jewish martyrs during the Maccabean revolt against the Greeks in 167 to 160 AD. Okay. So it was assumed in that context, in the context of that struggle, that a benevolent God must reward those who sacrifice themselves in His name or in His honor. Okay? So Jewish writings from that period thus hold that while we all die, death is only temporary. And in the future, everyone will receive their just rewards. Now, the book of Daniel, which the text says that it was written during the Babylonian exile, but it's widely understood to have been written during the Maccabean revolt around 165 BC. Okay. This book, the book of Daniel, is the latest book to enter to. Of all the biblical books, it is the latest to be composed, meaning that it's the newest book. It's the youngest book in the Bible. So the book of Daniel, which was written at around that time, probably in the 2nd century BC, expresses this belief in an afterlife explicitly. Okay, it says at the beginning of chapter 12 in the book of Daniel, it says, "And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall wake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." Okay, so that there will be a resurrection, and at that point, people will get their just desserts. Okay, and the book of Daniel is the only book in the Bible that says this, or anything like this, about resurrection or life after death. Now, while the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead pervaded Jewish writing from the Second Temple period and ever since, it was rejected as non-biblical, as wrong, by the priestly leadership in Judea. Josephus, who wrote in the 1st century A.D., okay, so at the very end of the period of the Second Temple, Josephus explains that the Sadducees, the Tzdukim, who were the prominent priestly class that ran the temple, Josephus tells us that these Tzdukim, the Sadducees, did not believe in an afterlife, nor in the resurrection of the dead. Okay. By contrast, their adversaries, the Pharisees, or Prushim, these were scholars of Jewish law who interpreted the Torah in light of oral traditions, what's called the Torah Shebe'al Peh, the oral Torah. These rabbis, okay, so the priestly class rejected the afterlife, rejected resurrection of the dead. By contrast, these scholars of Jewish law and these rabbis, communal religious leaders, they believed in both in an afterlife and in resurrection. Okay. So, in this division, the Sadducees, the Tzdukim, the priests, were the traditional upper-class priestly leadership of the Jews. And they were well represented in the temple bureaucracy and the Sanhedrin leadership, the civic leadership of the Jews under Roman rule. These Tzdukim, the Sadducees, held that the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, was the greatest authority on God's will and on God's demands of Jews. What does God want us to do? All other laws or texts outside the sacred Torah, including other books of the Bible, such as books of the prophets and the judges and the wisdom books, could not be counted as part of the law. Okay, the Torah is the most authoritative source on how we should conduct ourselves, what God wants, who God is, etc. In contrast, the Prushim, the Pharisees, were middle-class biblical scholars and teachers. Okay, again, these are rabbis. That's why we call the Pharisee version of Judaism, we call rabbinical Judaism. So the Pharisees were middle-class teachers. Okay, they weren't priests, and they challenged the spiritual leadership of the priestly class on a number of fronts. But the important ones for us are that first, the Pharisees believed that along with the written law, with the written Torah, God provided the Jews also with an oral law, a Torah Shebe'al Peh, a Torah of the heart, the spoken Torah. Okay, and this second Torah, the spoken Torah, the oral law, was delivered to us through revelations and through wisdom articulated by Jewish leaders and prophets who came after Moses. Okay, so various judges and prophets and also various sages of the Talmud, okay, of the period after the Bible was already signed and sealed. Okay. Thus, the Pharisees believed that God permits Jews to interpret the Torah through divine revelation and human reasoning. Second point of challenge to the Tzdukim, the Sadducees, the Pharisees taught that when the Torah spoke about reward for following God's ways, the reward, the meaning was a reward that is dispensed in the world to come, in the Olam Haba. By contrast, the Sadducees, the Tzdukim, did not believe in an afterlife in which God administers punishment and reward. Third, the Pharisees believed that God would send the Jews a Messiah at the end of days. And this Messiah would restore David's line, he would rule from Jerusalem, and he would bring peace to the world. And at that time, bodily resurrection, physical resurrection, would take place, Tchiat HaMetim, and that's when divine justice would be meted out to the good and the bad. Now, while this teaching was an innovation, okay, Jews did not believe this beforehand, the Pharisees insisted that they were not innovating, but rather they were simply uncovering truths in the text of the Torah that previous generations of readers could not discern. That the meaning of the Torah is revealed further and further with time. Okay, that it unfolds to us as time moves on. Okay, through divine revelation, through reasoning and debate and scholarship. Okay. By contrast, the Sadducees, the Tzdukim, did not believe in the end of days, did not believe in resurrection, did not believe in a Messiah. I mean, if they believed in a Messiah of sorts, this Messiah was an earthly leader of the Jews, some sort of king or leader. But he was an earthly figure, not an apocalyptical or kind of a spiritual being. And then the fourth point of contention, a point of challenge, is that the Pharisees believed that God is the author of all events and circumstances on earth. Okay? Thus, the Pharisees believed that God had punished the Jews by allowing pagan powers, like the Greeks and the Romans, to rule over them. Okay? Whereas the Sadducees did not attribute human events to God's intervention in the world. Okay? They held that man has free will, and thus man creates his own circumstances. So what you can see here is that the Sadducees' Judaism, the Judaism of the Tzdukim, was ancient Judaism. It was Jewish orthodoxy from the era of the first temple and before that, before the temple. Pharisees' Judaism was a modern Judaism. It was a new and mostly post-biblical Jewish orthodoxy that was establishing itself during and especially after the era of the Second Temple. These two groups vied for political and theological leadership during the era of the Second Temple, and it came to a head especially after the destruction of the temple. Okay. And it came to a head because the Sadducees' leadership, okay, their political and spiritual legitimacy, was undercut or was undermined by their openness to Hellenic culture and their opposition to the two Jewish revolts against Rome. After the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 A.D., this priestly caste of the Sadducees was further undermined or undercut severely because of the destruction of the temple. Okay, so after the destruction of the temple, we see the Sadducees virtually disappearing from the historical record, as did their theology. Okay, so they were discredited politically over time as a Hellenized elite that opposed Jewish national independence. But then on top of this erosion in their authority and legitimacy, their connection to the people, they were then functionally sidelined, made obsolete or redundant by the destruction of the Jewish temple. Because with the destruction of the temple, the center of Jewish life migrated from the temple in Jerusalem to the communal synagogues, where local rabbis, rather than priests, held sway. Okay, so the center of religious life migrated from where the priests were, just physically, from Jerusalem, from the temple, to the synagogues. Okay, from where the priests were to where the rabbis were. And these rabbis were increasingly of the Pharisee persuasion. And with the Sadducees' disappearance as a political and spiritual leadership, what remained after the Jewish revolts against Rome, what remained were the Pharisees, who established their authority in Jewish communities all over the Near East. Not as priests, but as rabbis, as teachers. Thus, the Pharisees' theology became mainstream Judaism, which at that point included the Pharisees' conception of an afterlife, and angels, and spirits, and demons, and the Messiah, the end of days, resurrection, and the divine intervention in this world. The Mishnah, which is a body of Jewish religious, theological, and legal rulings on how to conduct Jewish life in Jewish communities. So the Mishnah from 200 AD, roughly, states that all Israel have a portion in the world to come. But it qualifies this blanket statement, every Jew has a place in the world to come. It qualifies this with a list of Jews who don't. The list of Jews who are excluded, who don't have a place in the world to come. And these are anyone who maintains that resurrection is not a biblical doctrine, anyone who claims that the Torah was not divinely revealed, and anyone who's a heretic. Yeah, this is written in the Masechet Sanhedrin in chapter 10. So the first item on this list of people who cannot enter don't have a role, don't have a place in the afterlife, the first item on that list, okay, anyone who maintains that resurrection is not a biblical doctrine, it reveals to us the assault of this new Jewish theology, or this new Jewish theological orthodoxy, which upheld the afterlife. Its assault on the older Jewish orthodoxy, the now extinct Sadducee, the archaic Jewish belief that denied the afterlife. Okay, so you can see here in this list of people who don't have a place in the world to come, the establishment of a new Jewish orthodoxy and a banishment of the old Jewish orthodoxy. Okay, if you don't believe in the resurrection, if you argue that the resurrection of the dead is not biblical, you are muktzeh. Okay, you don't have, you're a heretic. Okay? And it was during this period, so you see here in this ruling evidence of this fight between these two conceptions, these two groups, and the victory of the newer belief system, the Pharisee belief system. It was during this period that early concepts of heaven, Garden of Eden, and hell, Gehenom, start to appear in Judaism. Christianity, which started to splinter from Judaism around this time in the 2nd century AD, began its life as a separate religion. Christianity began with this understanding of the afterlife, okay, of a heaven and a hell. Now, while the Mishnah at around 200 AD does not elaborate on the afterlife, I mean, it insists on it, but it doesn't explain details. By contrast, the Gemara, which came was sealed about 300 years later, so it's again from around 500 AD, the Gemara gives a much more complete view of the rabbi's view of life after death. Who goes to hell, for how long, what happens in hell, and of course also what happens in heaven. So in Masechet Brachot, the Talmud, the Gemara, explains that in the world to come, in the Olam Haba, there is no eating or drinking, no procreation or commerce, no jealousy, no enmity, and no rivalry. Okay? Instead, the righteous sit with crowns on their head and enjoy the radiance of the divine presence. Okay, so they tell us, what happens to people who go to hell, what happens to people, they describe the experience, so the engagement, the thinking and the ruling as to the mechanics of salvation and damnation, being cast to hell or elevated to heaven, has gone has progressed to such a degree that by 500 AD there are clear rulings or explanations as to the mechanics of what happens and the timing and the experience of being in heaven and being in hell. Now this history I gave you of the afterlife in Judaism, of the concept of an afterlife in Judaism, shows you that the book of Job has become outdated. Okay? This book, just like the story of Cain, offered a theological solution to the purported paradox of theodicy in a religion that did not have the notion of punishment and reward in an afterlife. Okay? But Judaism is no longer that kind of religion. And Christianity never was this kind of religion. Okay? Judaism has not been that kind of religion for about 2,000 years now. Okay? The belief in an afterlife in which people get rewarded and punishment has now been a part of Judaism for almost 2,000 years, or around 2,000 years. Okay? In the previous Judaism, version of Judaism, in biblical Judaism, in Sadducee, in Sadducee Judaism, the Judaism of the Tzdukim, unwarranted suffering takes place because of natural causes. Okay? Because of the nature of nature and because of the nature of man. Okay? The nature of nature is for disease to strike, wild animals to attack, floods, droughts, storms, earthquakes, etc. And the nature of man is for people to be selfish and callous and cruel and violent and abusive. Because, as God tells us in the Noah story, the inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. Now, the introduction of the afterlife into Judaism has provided Jews with a more consoling and unimpeachable solution to the problem of injustice in the world. Okay? Unwarranted suffering is rewarded in the afterlife with a blissful existence, in which the righteous are liberated from the harsh effects of the natural world. However, Judaism's embrace of the afterlife, of an afterlife, has introduced its own theological problems. Okay? And these are problems to which the Bible cannot speak directly, because the Bible reflects an earlier form of Judaism that did not, for the most part, consider the afterlife. Now, the most obvious theological problem introduced by the afterlife has to do with free will in the afterlife. If human nature is indeed the source of injustice, is indeed a source of injustice in the world, then surely it will remain so in the next world. Okay? Do we not take our free will, the most central feature of humanity? Do we not take free will with us to the next life? If we do, then the next life will be similar to this life, with the problem of selfishness, vanity, callousness, cruelty, and abuse following us wherever our souls go. And if we do not carry our free will to the next life, if the afterlife is a world without free will, then is it really bliss? Is it really desirable? Is it really a reward to be robbed of our free will and our moral autonomy? Okay, this theological question is, I think, more difficult for Jews than it is for Christians, simply because, by law of averages, because Judaism is insistent on free will, whereas Christians are internally split on this. Okay, it's a more complicated issue in Christianity. Moreover, because Christianity insists that God does have the ability to shape your heart. Okay, God does have the ability to control your heart in a way that Judaism denies. Moreover, Christians see the body as the source of human sinfulness. Okay? Disembodied spirits, therefore, have shed their evil inclination, their Yetzer Hara. Okay, and this is not, how Jews explain Yetzer Hara. It's not in the body. Okay, it's built into to the mind or to the soul. Or at least there's no division, no dualism. So in the moral universe of biblical Judaism, of Sadducee Judaism, that older Judaism, archaic Judaism of the biblical era, of the first temple and before the first temple, injustice in the world is not a paradox. It's instead a manifestation of God's gifts to humanity. A just and benevolent God gave us the blessings and abundance of nature, in which rain and storms come together as a package deal, as do sunlight and droughts, as do helpful microbes and harmful microbes, as do domestic animals and wild animals, as do good and bad volcanic activity. Okay, this activity, volcanic activity, gives us our fertile valleys and rich minerals, but also deadly earthquakes. God, likewise, in His goodness and justness, gave us our bodies and our minds, or our souls, which again come as a package deal with pain and death for the body. Look, pain is a lifesaver. You know, pain is what helps you avert death. But it's suffering. Okay, and death comes. You know, the price of life is death. Okay, so our bodies come as a package deal with pain and death, and our minds, or our souls, comes as a package deal with free will, meaning with evil choices, bad choices people make all the time. So this biblical version of Judaism, or this version of Judaism, the biblical version, the Sadducee version, did not require an afterlife to fix the injustices of this world. Because we have all received more than we were ever owed. Okay? When you receive $1 million gift and someone robs you $1,000 from you, and you lose another $50,000 in a flood, and you lose another $50,000 to taxes, you're still way ahead. Okay? There's nothing here that needs fixing. There's no injustice here. You're still, I can't do the math, but almost $1 million up. You know, so you're still way into the gift. Okay. So God's message to you can see it even in the first creation story. Okay, where God sends Adam and Eve into the world, and you know the hardships of life are not a punishment. Okay, Adam and Eve didn't sin, and they weren't punished. And the labor and hardships and death involved in life are not a punishment, they're the gift. So God's message to Job, therefore, is not that a reward awaits him in an afterlife, but that he is now, currently, enjoying the reward, even at his lowest, in his sorrow and sickness and pain. Okay. God tells the resentful Job what he told the resentful Cain. Remember your place. Okay. You simply are not competent to understand and judge God's actions and inactions. Instead of trying to understand God and judge him, Job should be thankful, Job and Cain should be thankful for all God did give him. And we, the readers of these two stories, have no cause to complain. You know, as we read these two stories, we get the message that we have no cause to complain about what God fails to give us or what he takes from us, since we deserved nothing at all from him to begin with. You know, since we received so much, even the poorest and sickest among us, since we received so much, we have no grounds to complain when we don't get more, or when somebody else gets more than we do, or when we lose some of what we have. Okay, we lose some wealth, we lose some possessions, we lose some health, we lose some friends and family that die along the way. We have no grounds to complain because we had all these things. Okay, again, that's that $1 million that you've now lost a few bucks from. And here, God's words to Cain maybe are more instructive simply because of how that story ends. Okay. God explains to Cain that if you let what you perceive as injustice in the world make you resentful about the world, okay, resentful and judgmental of people, Cain resents Abel, Job resents wicked people who aren't punished. Okay, so if you let what you perceive as injustice in the world make you resentful and judgmental of people, or resentful and judgmental of God, or of the world, then sin will tempt you and you will be ruined, as Cain indeed will be ruined in the next scene. If you live angrily, resentfully, you will not be able to control your crappy nature, your yetzer hara, and you will not be able to resist the temptation of sin. Okay? That is the real problem in your life, not what you perceive as injustice in the world. Thank you.